The empire of Dareth was founded on silence. Not the peace of quiet mornings or the hush of snowfall, but a silence built from obedience, from fear, from the muffled weight of history folded in on itself. Its laws were written in gesture, its sermons delivered in sign, and its punishments spoken only once, then never again. At the heart of the empire stood the Palace of Golden Silence, a sprawling fortress of ivory and onyx wrapped in banners bearing no sigils. It had no throne room, no echoing hall for debate. Instead, the empress ruled from a room where no sound could exist. Sound was a crime. Words were dangerous. And so they had built a nation on the belief that silence preserved order, that speech unraveled power. In the lower districts, in a lantern-lit quarter where tradesmen lived cheek to cheek with laborers, a girl named Lyra was born to a woman who once carried tales like fire in her throat. Her mother, Iresai, had been a storyteller before the old laws had tightened, a weaver of myths and songs remembered by heart. She carried stories that could soften grief, stir rebellion, or make a child laugh even through hunger. And for a time, she whispered them only in the dark, in alleys and basements, behind the backs of those who would silence her. But the empire watched everything, especially the ones who spoke too well. The year Lyra turned 7, Iresai was caught speaking aloud a forbidden tale, the one of the Red Prophet, who once dared say the Empress was mortal. The arrest was swift. The execution swifter. The city square was filled with bowed heads and folded hands, but Lyra was made to watch with her eyes open. Her mother's final words were torn from her before she could speak them, and the blade that followed did not shake as it passed through flesh. They say a silence settled over the square like frost. And in that silence, Lyra did not scream, did not cry. She only stared. She was taken from the square by the voice keepers that same day. The voice keepers were not priests though they wore robes. They were not soldiers though they carried blades. They were enforcers of stillness, those trained to sense the tremble of breath before a sentence formed, to hear the thought before it became sound. Within their sanctum, deep inside the Palace of Golden Silence, children like Lyra were raised. Not to speak, never to speak, but to learn the laws of quiet, the patterns of gesture and gaze, the subtle art of obedience that did not require sound. Her voice was not taken immediately. For those too young, the voice keepers waited. They watched. They starved the urge to speak from the child's body, replacing it with ritual and rhythm, until language dried out on its own. Some children wept soundlessly at night. Others forgot how to cry at all. Lyra did neither. She watched. Even without words, she remembered her mother's voice. Not the words themselves, they had been stolen, flayed from memory by the tools of the palace, but the tone, the rhythm, the cadence of breath and pause. She could not hear it but she felt it. And that was something the voice keepers could not erase. She was marked for obedience like all the others. A white thread sewn down the center of her tunic, the symbol of silence worn visibly at all times. If a child so much as mouthed a word in sleep, the thread was cut and restitched in black, a sign of failure. Black threads meant punishment. Red meant exile. No one returned from exile. Years passed. Lyra did not earn a black thread. Nor a red. She watched the others fall. One boy who hummed in sleep, one girl who whispered to herself while drawing in the dirt, and they vanished. Taken to the inner chambers. Lyra kept her silence with the discipline of a blade. But her eyes learned to scream. There was power in watching, in never blinking, in remembering the curve of every hand gesture used in the dark. The voice keepers did not see it. They believed themselves masters of control, unchallenged in their authority. But Lyra saw the cracks. The priest who flinched near a mirror, the guard whose hands trembled at dusk prayers, the way even the Empress's own shadow seemed to hesitate at the chapel doors. She was 14 when they tried to take her tongue. It was not punishment. It was initiation. A sacred ceremony to welcome her into the ranks of the voice keepers, to ensure she would never again carry the temptation of speech. She had not uttered a sound in 7 years. But they did not trust restraint. They trusted mutilation. She was led into the chamber beneath the sanctum, where the walls were draped in silk to catch blood. The surgeon priest bowed to her in silence. She bowed in return. She was told to kneel. And then, without prayer or farewell, they raised the blade. But something happened. The room flickered. The candle flames bent sideways though there was no wind. And Lyra's eyes, always watching, opened wide. She did not cry out. But her stare fixed on the priest's face with such force that he froze mid-motion. His hand trembled. The blade slipped. A thin cut opened on her tongue, just enough to burn, to bleed, to taste iron, but no more. Then the lights went out. In the darkness, someone whispered her name. Not the one the palace had given her, not the number mark etched on her collarbone, but her name, the name her mother used, the one the empire never knew. Lyra. When the lights returned, the priest had collapsed. His mouth was moving but no sound emerged. His eyes were wide and bleeding at the corners. Lyra stood. No one stopped her. She walked out of the chamber with blood on her lips and silence in her mouth, but her eyes blazed with something the voice keepers could not explain. She was allowed to leave the sanctum the next day, assigned to watch the outer gates. A promotion they claimed. But she knew what it was. They feared her. They should. Because Lyra remembered the square. She remembered the last look her mother gave her. She remembered the silence they forced her to keep. And she remembered the name she was never meant to hear again. There were no words in her throat. There didn't need to be. Because her eyes had learned the shape of a curse. And she was waiting to speak it. Billy. The sentence was final. She had spoken. The moment had been quiet, almost hidden, like a spark inside a closed box. She'd been cleaning the lower shrine alone, as was her duty. Dust gathered thick in the seams of the sacred stones, and Lyra had traced them with her fingers as she worked. A prayer had risen unbidden, not aloud at first, just in her chest, pulsing like blood. And then it had escaped. One word. Her mother's name. Eressa. Soft as breath, it had slipped from her lips and vanished into the shadows. But the walls of the temple remembered sound, even after years of silence. And so did the high priest. He had heard her. Or perhaps the temple itself had told him. They did not question her. They did not ask for confession. A single word was enough to brand her criminal. No trial. No mercy. Only the ceremony of removal. She had always known this day would come. In the high chamber, where golden light filtered through narrow slats in the ceiling, the high priest waited with robes of bone-white silk and hands scrubbed raw. On a table before him lay the ceremonial knife, curved like a crescent moon, polished until it gleamed with its own malice. He was old, with eyes like clouded glass and lips cracked from decades of silence. His presence smelled of iron and old vows. Lyra was led to the altar and made to kneel. No words were spoken. No rites were chanted. The priest approached and lifted her chin with two cold fingers. She did not flinch. He studied her a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly he reached for the blade. The guards tensed, watching. Lyra's breathing slowed. The priest lowered the knife. When it touched her tongue, the steel was colder than she expected. The cut was swift, practiced. A single slice, deep and final. Blood filled her mouth. Her head swam. But she did not scream. She swallowed the pain. Her face did not change. And when the priest looked into her eyes, she looked back. Something passed between them. The priest froze. His hands dropped to his sides, the knife clattering to the floor. His breath caught. His pupils widened as if something invisible had struck him. Then, slowly he stumbled backward. He staggered against the altar, clutching at the marble with fingers that had silenced hundreds. A tremor ran through his arms. A whimper slipped past his lips, not of fear but of awe. She stood. Her tongue burned, her mouth throbbed with the raw wound, and blood dripped down her chin. But she stood. And she looked at him. He dropped to his knees. Around the chamber the other voice keepers recoiled. One covered her face. Another back toward the door. Lyra turned her eyes toward each of them, one by one. And they looked away. From that day forward, strange things began to happen. At first it was small. A monk who fainted when Lyra met his gaze, claiming he saw his dead brother standing behind her. A servant girl who dropped a tray and whispered, "She saw my dream." A guard who stumbled back in terror, eyes wide with the memory of a fire long buried in his childhood. They spoke in hushed tones, these frightened ones. They called it a curse, a trick of light, a ghost witch's stare. But none of them could bear to look into Lyra's eyes for long. She was still voiceless. Her mouth was sealed with pain and silence. But her gaze had become something else, something sharp, something unrelenting. When she looked, she saw. Not just faces or shapes. She saw guilt. Shame. Memories clawed from the dark. Secrets too long buried. Desires too long suppressed. The people of the temple learned to avoid her eyes. But they could not unsee what they had already glimpsed. And Lyra, though silent, began to understand. There was more than one kind of voice. The empire had stolen her tongue. But her eyes were beginning to speak. And what they whispered would not be forgotten. They sent her away under cover of night, bound in silence and shadow. No procession marked her exile. No guards escorted her through the winding canyons. Only a single cloaked monk guided her on foot, never speaking, never glancing back. The air grew colder the farther they walked, the stars above sharpening like knives. At dawn they reached the edge of the empire's voice, the place where words had long been swallowed by stone. The monastery stood like a wound in the mountain, built into the face of a cliff, 100 steps above the frostline. Its walls were old, predating the empire of Dareth, its stones carved with unreadable symbols half swallowed by lichen. Here the sacred order of the Silent Brothers kept their ancient watch, muttering no prayers, singing no hymns. Their silence was not enforced, it was chosen, buried deep in devotion. Yet even they shrank from Lyra when she arrived. They had heard what happened in the temple. They had heard what she'd done with her eyes. They gave her a cell carved from basalt, a thin mat to sleep on, a basin for water. No one greeted her. No one instructed her. She was meant to fade, to wither beneath years of stone and absence. But Lyra did not fade. Each morning she walked the empty halls. Each night she sat beneath the inner archways and stared at the carvings etched into the rock. Spirals, hooks, coils, some were delicate as brushstrokes, others brutal as knife wounds. They were not decorative. They were language. Not one she knew, but one that called to her. She spent hours tracing them with her fingers, eyes open, mind still. Her dreams filled with silver lines, drifting glyphs, and voices with no mouths. The wind whispered syllables she did not know but somehow understood. The language of stone. The grammar of silence. She began to copy the symbols in dirt with sticks, in steam on her cell's cold walls. Over time she understood how some shapes connected, how one glyph for watchfulness followed the sigil for darkness to mean hidden memory. She learned to move her fingers in sequence while locking eyes with someone. Slowly, a new kind of speech formed, not of tongue or tone but of gaze and gesture, rhythm and stillness. She was not inventing it. She was remembering. The monks watched from a distance, wary. One tried to approach her once. A gaunt man with a face folded by years and eyes like polished bone. He bent to look at the symbols she'd drawn in the frost and reached out to erase one. She stared at him, long, steady, unblinking. He froze, then turned and fled. After that, they avoided her. In silence she continued. On the 7th moon of her exile, Lyra found the locked chamber. It was hidden behind the monastery's oldest wall, sealed by a collapsed archway and roots thick with age. While following the pattern of glyphs one evening, she noticed a missing sequence, an unfinished phrase. It ended at the broken wall, where a crack snaked through the stone like a vein. She pressed her hand to the stone. It hummed. That night the wind howled down the cliff face. The monks lit candles at the base of their beds. No one saw Lyra slip into the hall with her fingers smeared in ash, her eyes glowing faintly silver in the dark. She traced the missing glyph and stood on the wall. She blinked once, and the stones moved. A low groan echoed through the monastery as the arch cracked open. Dust and bone spilled out. Inside, a chamber ringed with carvings far older than the empire, symbols carved not with tools but by something deeper. A language of curses, of true names, of things forbidden. At the center, a stone basin sat beneath a shaft of moonlight. Empty, waiting. Lyra stepped forward. She did not know why she knelt. She only knew she must. The glyphs above the basin shimmered as she lowered her head. And when she looked into the hollow stone, she saw not her reflection, but her mother's eyes. Open. Burning. Mouth stitched shut. Then came the voice, not spoken but imprinted inside her skull. A language without words. A cry without sound. Finish it, the voice said. Unseal what they buried. She opened her eyes. And the basin bled. Thin rivulets of crimson ran down the stone as if the walls themselves had been wounded. The symbols along the chamber pulsed red, glowing from within. Blood dripped from the ceiling, from the carvings, from the roots that had once blocked her path. It was not illusion. It was memory made flesh. The monastery screamed. Not in words, but in creaking timber, in shattering glass, in the ragged gasps of monks waking to a world that could no longer pretend. They found her standing in the chamber's center, her back to them, her eyes wide and luminous. They dared not speak. They dared not look too long. The eldest monk fell to his knees, weeping blood. Another tore out his own eyes. They knew what she had done. She had spoken with silence. She had cursed with vision. She had awakened what the empire swore was dead. And the stones, once mute, had begun to whisper again. In the capital, where the marble streets gleamed like bleached bone and the towers of the voice keepers scraped the sky, word began to slip through the cracks. Not loudly, not openly, just murmurs at first, like the rustle of dry parchment turning itself in a still room. A girl, they said. A girl without a tongue. A girl with eyes that made men weep blood. The empress did not hear it directly. No one dared speak such things to her face. But the whispers rode the robes of merchants, braided themselves into the prayers of silent priests, slithered through the drafts of libraries and back corridors. When the empress finally looked up from her decree scrolls, it was because her birds, spies cloaked as monks and scribes, began to return with strange reports. A girl in the mountains. No voice but something else. People claiming to see their childhoods reflected in her eyes. One boy had fallen to his knees and spoken the names of the dead, names even his mother had forgotten. Another man had torn pages from a sacred text and screamed that the ink itself had lied. The empress frowned, unmoved. Superstition bred easily in the cracks of discipline. But this particular rumor, it stirred something older. She summoned her circle of royal sorcerers. They bowed low and listened as she spoke. "There is a story growing where there should be silence," she said. "You will find its root. And pull it." The first sorcerer chosen was Master Telfan, an archivist of memory who wore glass lenses over his eyes and had not blinked in 30 years. He rode north with a satchel of null ink, designed to suppress false visions. He did not return. Instead, a courier arrived 2 weeks later bearing his robes, folded with surgical care. A note had been carved into the courier's arm. He saw. The second was Yelra of the Unheard Flame, cloaked in fireproof silks and veil-bound in chains of salt. She lasted longer. Her screams reached the border monastery where Lyra now wandered. But no one understood what she said, because her tongue had been pulled from her own mouth, her hands gouging deep into her own skull, nails still bloody. The empress grew still as ice. The palace servants stopped meeting one another's eyes. In the garden where speech was forbidden, the trees stopped blooming. That was when the empress consulted the old things. In a locked chamber beneath the throne room sat a vault carved from obsidian, lined in lead, sealed with gold. Only 3 knew how to open it. Only the empress had the right to enter. Inside it lived the oracles, not women, not ghosts, but something woven between. They had no faces, only masks carved with the names of forgotten stars. They spoke in unison in a voice like ropes pulled through teeth. "The eye has opened." The empress stepped closer. The girl? She is not a girl. She is what remains. Of what was torn. Of what was burned. Of what saw the truth and swallowed it whole. Can she be killed? You may silence the tongue. You may break the hands. But you cannot unsee what has seen. The empress turned, eyes narrowing. The answer was not one she would accept. She commanded a third envoy, this time not a sorcerer, but a troop of elite assassins sworn never to speak, never to fear. They carried weapons etched with runes meant to sever spirit as well as flesh. They left at dusk. Only one returned, riding without a horse, barefoot, eyes bandaged, mouth sewn shut with red thread. Across his chest was carved a single line, "She sees what you bury." That was when the empress gave the order, capture her. Not kill. Not exile. Capture. She wanted to see for herself. So the bounty was declared in silence. Messengers rode to the edges of the empire, bearing tablets with only one symbol, an eye surrounded by sun rays struck through with a blade. The price was left unnamed. But every mercenary, every zealot, every desperate soul knew what it meant. They came in droves. But none returned as they left. Some wandered back blind, laughing at nothing, cradling handfuls of ash as if it were gold. Others crawled on bleeding knees, begging forgiveness from trees, from birds, from the very road. A few were found speaking in ancient tongues, carving glyphs into their skin. And still the girl remained free. Lyra did not run. She walked. Through villages that fell silent at her approach. Through ruins where words had once lived. Through dreams not her own. She did not need to fight. She only needed to look. When she stared into someone's eyes, their mind uncoiled. Memories unlatched. Secrets spilled. Some wept for lost children. Others confessed crimes long buried beneath empire-stamped loyalty. A few simply dropped their weapons, knelt and touched their foreheads to the dirt. The world began to change in small ways. Books were found half-burned in temple hearths, with symbols no priest could explain. Mirrors cracked in homes where lies had once been easy. Infants cried when shown the imperial sigil. And everywhere the whisper grew louder. She remembers. She sees. She is what they tried to silence. The empress, high upon her marble throne, could feel it in her bones, that something was unraveling. Not loudly. Not quickly. But steadily. Like thread slipping from a cloak. Like breath leaving a body. Like an empire forgetting its own name. And still the girl walked. Still her eyes glowed. And still, none who met her gaze ever returned the same. Lyra entered the capital of Darheth not with an army behind her, but with silence so complete it roared. The city of gleaming spires and carved hush-wards had not seen war in 100 years, but now its streets filled with the voiceless. They did not shout. They did not raise blades. They walked. Under moonlight, the city's enchantments failed, lamplight flickered out, sound-dampening runes cracked, and banners sewn with imperial mantras turned to ash mid-air. The guards who stood at the outer gates, trained to block armies not silences, fell to their knees as Lyra passed. One dropped his sword. Another simply removed his helmet, closed his eyes and wept without knowing why. No order was given. No call was made. And yet the gates to the palace opened. They opened without touch, without wind, without sound. As if the stone had waited, held its breath through decades of tyranny, and now, with Lyra standing before it, could no longer bear to remain closed. Inside, the court had gathered. The Empress's ministers stood in formation on the throne steps, clad in shimmering robes woven with spells of misdirection, of defense, of memory shielding. Their faces were hidden behind mirrored masks, polished so finely that they reflected not themselves, but those who looked upon them. To stare into such a mask was to be shown your own eyes, your own judgment. Others wore blindfolds soaked in blessed ink, etched with glyphs meant to protect the mind from prophetic rot. And behind them, flanking the hall, the final defense. The echo guards whose minds had been broken and reshaped by imperial sorcery, trained to kill any who bore signs of forbidden sight. Lyra stepped forward alone. Her bare feet touched the obsidian floor of the throne hall, and where she walked, cracks spread like ink through parchment. Her eyes moved from masked face to masked face. She said nothing. Her hands remained at her sides. But already the masks began to tremble. The first to fall was the Minister of Memory, a woman who had once signed the order to erase an entire dialect spoken by a mountain village. Her mask fogged over and then melted. She screamed as her own language turned on her, erupting from her throat in guttural sounds, her forgotten mother tongue tearing her apart from within. She collapsed, choking on syllables no longer under her control. Then the Grand Auditor, who had watched the public burnings of unregistered poets. His blindfold blackened and curled. When he tore it away, his eyes met Lyra's, and what he saw there was not her, but every verse he had condemned to silence. He began reciting them uncontrollably, blood pouring from his nose as line after line left him with the force of vengeance. The echo guards moved. Fast. Inhuman. Their steps distorted sound, their blades made to silence anything unnatural. But Lyra looked at them, just looked, and they halted. Stilled mid-lunge, swords raised. Her gaze moved through them like a wind through dying trees. One by one they began to shake. Not from fear but from unraveling. The magic that had stripped them of self reversed, drawn back into their bodies like smoke returning to a fire. They collapsed, weeping or shouting, some calling names they hadn't spoken since childhood. Others ran. A high priest tried to cast a glyph of forgetfulness. The ink sizzled on his skin and turned into old scars he had carved into others. He tore at his own robes and sobbed. No one could bear to meet her gaze for long. And yet Lyra never blinked. She advanced step by step, slow, steady like judgment itself. Not furious. Not cruel. Just inevitable. She passed the columns of the great hall, each engraved with the deeds of the Empress's ancestors. As she walked by, the carvings blackened and cracked. History itself recoiled. The throne stood at the far end of the hall, atop 6 white marble steps. The Empress did not sit upon it. She stood beside it, robed in silence-woven cloth, face bare, lips unpainted, crown absent. Her eyes met Lyra's across the echoing hall. And in that moment something passed between them. The Empress tried to speak. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Lyra took another step forward. From somewhere deep within the palace stones, a groan began to rise, not of collapse but of remembrance. Whispers returned to walls that had been scrubbed clean of sound. Screams long buried echoed faintly. Laughter. Prayers. Betrayals. Songs. The throne itself cracked. Not split. Not shattered. But carved, etched slowly by invisible hands with one mark. An eye. Wide open. Weeping. Then Lyra spoke with no voice. She turned her gaze to the courtiers who remained, those still masked, still blindfolded, still hoping for immunity in their illusions. They froze. And each one saw themselves. Not as they thought they were. Not as they pretended to be. But as they were, in the moment they decided silence was safer than truth. One by one they collapsed. One by one they clawed at their masks, their eyes, their memories. The court of Dareth fell, not by fire nor blade nor spell, but by the weight of being seen. Lyra stood beneath the throne and waited. She did not speak. She had never needed to. And above her, the moon rose through the shattered glass dome, painting everything in silver. The echoes of power broke. And silence remembered. The Empress waited alone in the throne room now. The court had collapsed into madness and memory, and the guards lay curled in their own forgotten names. Smoke from overturned braziers drifted toward the broken dome above, where moonlight poured like pale water over the stone floor, washing away the last protections of the Empire's spells. She stood before the throne, tall and still, wrapped in robes that shimmered with the glyphs of silence and protection. Her hands were clasped behind her back, her spine straight, her chin lifted as if daring the night to challenge her. Around her neck hung the golden seal of the Voice Keepers, and circling her brow was the narrow circlet of emperors past, a crown carved from the bone of the first rebels silenced by the Empire. Beneath her skin, spells pulsed. Her breath was steady. She had been made invincible by rites older than the city's stones. She had sat upon the throne since she was a girl, taught to rule by fear, to suppress words before they could take root, to drown stories before they bloomed into truths. So she stood now, with her spell-thick body and her shadowless gaze, certain that nothing could touch her. Then Lyra stepped into the chamber. She crossed the threshold with bare feet and blood-streaked ankles. The silence moved with her, deep, sharp, absolute. Not the hollow stillness the Empress had enforced across the Empire, but something heavier, denser. A silence with shape and weight and voice. The Empress turned to face her. Lyra did not bow. She took one more step forward and raised her eyes. There were no weapons in her hands. She wore no armor. The moon traced silver along her shoulders, outlining her in a light the Empire had long tried to forbid. Her eyes glowed with something too ancient to be named. The Empress narrowed her own. "I know what you are," she said, and her voice echoed, thin, distant, like it belonged to someone long dead. "You are a ghost built of regret. You are the fever dream of traitors. I cannot be harmed by visions. I cannot be broken by stares." Lyra said nothing. Her gaze held steady. "You come bearing memory," the Empress went on, "but I have buried the past beneath temples. I have rewritten the stories. I have silenced every mother's song and every father's tale. Do you think memory frightens me?" Still Lyra did not move. But her eyes did. And the Empress's breath caught. She tried to look away but her neck froze. Her knees locked. Her arms grew heavy. Lyra's gaze held her in place like iron. Then it began. Not with pain, but with vision. The throne room faded. The walls of carved silence melted into images. She saw a child, no older than 6, kneeling in the street as a scribe branded his tongue for saying the name of a banned god. She saw a group of singers hanged from trees, their mouths stuffed with paper inscribed with verses the Empress had declared unfit for the ears of the state. She saw a village burned to ash, its dialect erased from the Empire's scrolls, its children forced to learn only silence. She saw the Empress herself, young and afraid, told she must be cold to rule, must be voiceless to command, must destroy beauty before it dared bloom. And deeper still, she saw the Empress in the night, eyes wide and sleepless, bathing in oils to cleanse the dreams, whispering to statues for forgiveness that never came. The Empress tried to speak again, but the words stopped in her throat. Ash began to gather on her tongue. She coughed. A dry, rasping sound. She reached for her mouth and pulled away a smear of gray dust. It coated her fingers. She looked to her sleeves, they too were darkening, flaking. Her golden sigils crumbled into powder. The glyphs around her crown blackened and peeled. "No," she gasped. "This is an illusion. This is a trick." But her voice was already breaking. From her lungs came no air, only soot. Every breath became harder. Her chest rose in panic. Her skin began to smoke. And Lyra kept looking. The Empress fell to her knees. The moonlight, once cold and distant, now blazed on her like fire. It carved truth where lies had lived too long. Her bones ached with it. Her spine bent. "You are not real," she rasped. But Lyra was real. Her silence was real. Her gaze was a mirror polished by agony, by memory, by every voice the Empress had stolen from the world. And the Empress could not look away. The throne behind her cracked again, deepening the sigil Lyra had left earlier. The stone began to bleed ash. The tapestries on the walls caught fire without flame, burning silently. The Empress's mouth opened wide. Her scream made no sound. Her eyes turned black. The ash poured from her nose, her ears, her fingertips. She tried to crawl but her arms gave way. Her golden sandals split. Her robes fell apart in streams of dust. She reached toward Lyra. But her hand crumbled mid-air. The Empress collapsed to the ground as a husk of memory, her body reduced to a cloak of silence and a pile of ash that no wind dared touch. Lyra lowered her eyes. The throne stood empty. And for the first time in 1,000 years, no one claimed it with silence. There were no horns, no cries of victory, no cheers rising from the streets of the capital. Only silence deeper than silence. A silence that swallowed sound not in absence but in command. A silence that said, "Be still, unmake, remember nothing and everything all at once." Lyra stood where the Empress had fallen, if falling was even the right word for what had happened. Ash did not fall. It dispersed. It became part of the breathless air. The spell-wrought bones of the Empire had dissolved not with a sword stroke but with a gaze, a blink and a long-forbidden truth made visible. The court, what remained of it, had fled before her. Ministers who had screamed sermons of obedience now huddled beneath their own thrones, sobbing like children in a forgotten language. Scribes tried to write her name to brand her as heretic, only to find their ink curdled on the page, quills splitting, parchment flaking to dust. Still no one spoke. No one dared. She had spoken with no tongue. She had broken a crown without lifting her hands. And now the Empire responded, not with resistance but with collapse. It began with the banners. One by one, those that hung from the citadel towers curled inward as if from fire, though no flame touched them. Their colors, crimson, gold, imperial white, blackened, the thread unraveling itself. Each banner, a declaration of conquest, erased its own symbols. The eye of silence, the emblem of the throne, faded first. Next the crown. Then the words beneath it, order through silence. Gone. The banners sagged, dissolved, fell. In the hall of records, scrolls turned gray. Pages warped. Decrees crumbled into blankness. Laws penned a century ago bled out their letters like spilled wine. Even the tablets carved in stone wept ink until their runes blurred and faded. History itself, it seemed, was retreating, ashamed of its own tongue. In the streets, the people watched. They gathered in clusters, unsure whether to run or kneel. But Lyra gave no command, made no gesture. She simply walked. As she passed, light posts shattered their own glass. Statues turned their faces away. Fountains stopped midstream, water trembling in midair before falling in silence. The great bells in the Temple of Quiet cracked in their spires. 1,000 pigeons scattered from the towers at once and never returned. Lyra walked beneath them with bare feet and ash at her heels. Then came the stars. She looked up once. Not for long. Not with intent to bend or shatter. But merely to know. Her eyes, polished by loss and shaped by silence, reflected the night sky back at itself. And something above blinked in answer. The constellations flickered. Stars rearranged themselves like letters on a forgotten page, some pulsing, others vanishing. The sky seemed to ripple, as if the heavens themselves had witnessed what she had done and no longer knew how to behave. An old man in the outer market saw his shadow cast not behind him but in 4 directions at once. A girl sitting on her rooftop suddenly wept without knowing why. A sailor in the harbor dropped his rope and gasped to find the moon where the sun should have been for a single breath's time, then blinked and it was gone. Time cracked. Not loudly. Not like glass or thunder. But like paper folding. Like memory peeling back at the edges. Somewhere, a sun set where it should have risen. In the eastern provinces, night held longer than it should, and the stars spelled a word that no one dared speak. In the center of the palace, where the throne had been, Lyra stood alone. The Empress's robes lay scattered like shed skin, faded to the same gray ash as the bodies of those who had bound her silence. No trace of her crown remained. No bones, no name. Nothing. Only the faint impression of a mouth opened in shock. Or awe. Or apology. Lyra had seen it just before the Empress vanished. Lips moving, forming a word no one would ever hear. Not because it was too soft. Not because it was forbidden. But because the curse she bore was complete. The silence she carried was not the Empress's, born of fear and control, but an older thing. A silence that witnessed. That remembered. That burned names into the soul and stripped lies from the marrow. And now it spoke in the air itself. The wind moved around Lyra, stirring her hair. Dust circled her ankles in reverent spirals. Her shadow stretched longer than the walls behind her. She did not move. She had no need. From the far edge of the city, the bell of the southern watchtower rang, but no one had touched it. In the north, the river stopped flowing for 3 beats of a heart, then surged forward, clearer than it had been in generations. And from all across the empire, those who had lost their tongues in punishment felt something stir. Not the return of speech, but the return of presence. They were no longer invisible. They were no longer forgotten. And they were no longer alone. Lyra raised her hand, slowly. What? It was not a wave, not a threat. It was a farewell. And the sky blinked again. She was gone. No one saw her leave. No one saw her fall. No one could say if she ever closed her eyes. One morning, the steps leading to the palace were empty where she had last stood. The wind moved as if around a body still present, the light curving, reluctant to say she had vanished. But she had. At least in the way people understand vanishing. Some say Lyra became a constellation. That the stars above Dareth shifted one night, arranging themselves into the shape of a single eye, half-lidded, ancient, and glimmering with silver. Farmers claim their crops grow better if they plant under its gaze. Midwives whisper that newborns who open their eyes under that star cry in a language older than sound. Astronomers cannot chart it. It moves. Some nights it disappears entirely, and those nights are uneasy. Dogs whine, mirrors crack, the air hums. Others say she walks still. That when tyrants speak cruelty aloud, their voices catch on invisible thorns. That when a blade is raised in punishment, the wrist trembles. That when a lie is etched in law, it bleeds ink before it can dry. In the kingdom's furthest corners, guards have sworn they've seen a figure in moonlight, just standing watching. They find no footprints. Only their own thoughts echoing back at them, sharper than before. In the villages, mirrors are no longer kept in bedrooms. Not because they fear her, but because they respect her. Parents teach their children to blink before saying anything cruel. She might be watching, they say, not as a threat but as a reminder. Eyes are no longer simple things. They are windows. They are weapons. They are prayers. Statues of her began to appear. Not raised with ceremony, not commissioned by kings. Just found. In riverbeds, in caves, in abandoned temples. No chisel marks. No seams. As if they rose from the stone itself. None are identical, yet all carry the same shape. A woman cloaked in silence, her head slightly tilted. Her mouth is closed. Her throat bears no scar. But her eyes, always, are obsidian, polished so black they seem wet. When the sun touches them they flicker. Not reflect. Flicker. Children touch the statues gently, then turn and stare at the world as if newly awakened. Some weep without knowing why. Some laugh like they've remembered something that never happened. In the great library that once banned all non-sacred texts, a door that had been sealed for a century cracked open on its own. Inside, nothing but a circle of mirrors, all facing inward. No reflection stays long. Look too long and you see someone else's eyes. Not always hers. Sometimes your own, but different. As if seen through her. As if seen truly. Scholars tried to explain it. Theories emerged. Magical residue. Cultural hysteria. But the more they tried to document her, the less the pages held. Ink faded. Descriptions blurred. One historian wrote a 20-volume tome about the fall of the empire and did not mention her once. The margins, however, were filled with drawings of eyes he could not remember making. In the ruins of the palace, no throne stands. The dais is bare, but etched into the floor is a single phrase, scrawled in an unknown hand: "Watch what you become when no one dares speak your name." It is the only text that does not fade. In some places people pray to her. Not in temples, but when their children are ill, or when they must say something no one else believes. They speak it aloud, then close their eyes, imagining hers. When they open them again they feel steadier. Not safe but seen. Understood. And that is its own kind of power. There is no nation to rebuild. No crown to chase. No one rose to replace her because she was never seated. Her curse was not thrown but lived. Not shouted but shown. Memory became its own empire and it bowed to no one. Silence became sacred again, but not the silence of fear. This was a silence that listened. That waited for truth. That asked, not demanded. In this silence people built new ways of being. Gestures became poetry. Stillness a kind of sermon. Looking someone in the eyes, truly looking, became both invitation and oath. And somewhere in a place beyond sound and stone she watches still. They say when the next empire rises with cruelty on its lips and erasure in its heart, she will return. Not to fight. Not to shout. But to look. And in that gaze, everything false will come undone. Some say she's already here, standing beside every child who dares to speak their truth. Some say she never left, only folded herself into the world's hidden corners. Some say she waits in every mirror. They cut her tongue in silence, but her eyes spoke a curse that swallowed the empire.